Okay, so picking up from last week, for this class, I want to try to finish up talking about Coriolanus. One thing that I referenced last week, but I'd like to pick up on it now, is this article from the Washington Post, Fix This Democracy Now, or as I call it, 38 Bad Ideas about uh, about democracy. Now, again, going back to what I was talking about last class, this would fit into my contention that there is no, authentic tribune basically within the United States. There is no institution that even comes close to really, performing the same role or function that the tribunes were supposed to play in ancient Rome. And I mentioned a couple of, contenders for that, possibly being being the House of Representatives, which I would argue does not play that role. The media, of course, is often considered to be a contender for that as well. I've already covered many aspects of where I think the media very much falls short within this country, not least of which, of course, is talking about their unwavering support for U.S. imperialism, whether it's the invasion of Iraq or any number of conflicts going on now. We talk, for that matter, about the horrible take on art and culture within this country. The sort of hostility towards the classics and things like this. So now we're really turning more to domestic politics, and there are people that will defend the New York Times and the Washington Post. They'll acknowledge, yeah, their coverage of international affairs is pretty bad actually, but when it comes to domestic political issues, they're better, or so it is claimed. I would argue, and I would submit this as evidence to show you that their grasp on domestic politics within this country is not much better. And I mean, right off the bat, I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but if I can offer any serious commentary other than the fact that they're all just like stupid, basically, which I do feel about most of them. One thing that stands out, I think, right away is that, these are supposedly 38 ideas. This article was published in late 2017. So Bernie Sanders has already come on the scene and things like that. Socialism is a rising movement within the United States. There's not one socialist point of view expressed in this entire article. It's 38 ideas, all basically liberal and conservative. I mean, in fact, they even acknowledge that. They say 38 conservative, liberal ideas, which I agree with. Everything else I disagree with. Practical, creative, broad, specific. But it's true. They couldn't fit one socialist idea within this entire article. And as it is, that there's not a single discussion of healthcare, of the staggering levels of inequality that exists within this country, the explosive rise in the cost of living within the United States, price of housing, education, healthcare, etc. Not one. And what you have are just 38, I would say, very shallow, superficial ideas about politics within this country. And they look, they acknowledge that democracy is badly damaged within the United States. Of course, they start in a very unoriginal way with a quote from Tocqueville. Any political scientist student should be familiar with Tocqueville's Democracy in America. That being said, it's a very cliched way to start an essay about democracy within the United States. Almost as bad as starting an essay with a dictionary definition of democracy, which I've actually seen. I've actually had that experience in class. One time, I asked the class, is the United States can still be considered a democratic country? I think like out of maybe 15 students in the class, all but 2 of them basically started off with a dictionary definition of democracy. It doesn't say much for again, originality or creativity or anything like that. And by the way, this was at NYU, which is supposed to be one of the best schools in the country. But I wasn't exactly impressed with the students I had there, I got to say, in all honesty. So beyond that, if there's anything else I can add as far as serious commentary goes, what I think a lot of these ideas express, not all of them, but a lot of them express, is a very kind of superficial what I'll call I idealism. Now, in philosophical terms, the sort of polar opposite, if you will, of materialism is idealism. Marx, who is associated with a materialist, understanding of history, sort of built his theory out of, sort of in reaction to or in a rejection of the early so-called idealist philosophers, most notably Hegel, and some of the so-called German idealist philosophers before him, including Kant and various other important figures. So basically, the idea, basically the doctrine of idealism, if you will, is the idea that ideas matter. Ideas are the most important thing. Ideas are what motivate people to act, and things like that. Whereas materialism would argue the opposite, right? That the most important thing are the material conditions which people find themselves. And I would argue that a lot of these articles show that, an even more kind of superficial version of idealism, which is that they honestly seem to believe that if you can somehow change the way people think, you can change the way people are and act, without changing any of the material conditions which people find themselves in, which I find to be shockingly ignorant, and again extremely superficial, as well. And again, not to go into the whole debate of idealism and materialism, but I mean, you could also argue, I think that sort of opens the way to maybe a kind of synthesis between those views. And I would argue to some extent Marx does that, as well as other thinkers after him. Marx is commonly referred to as an economic determinist thinker, meaning that he just reduces everything to economics. And I can see why people think that, but I think also if you read his ideas closely, I think he is aware of the importance of ideas as well. But understanding the importance of ideas in the context of real material relations that exist between people as well. These articles, or again, many of these ideas here, don't display any understanding of that at all, and simply, again, seem to argue that you can somehow change the way people act, including very sort of deep-seated, long-standing, problems within American politics, simply by changing the way people think about things, or encouraging people to change the way they think about things, without changing any of the material circumstances at all. So I'll just run through a few of these things, or I'll just run through the article very, very quickly. Now, those that aren't, these sort of very superficial idealist solutions, quote unquote, solutions, often tend to be on the other end of the spectrum, very technocratic. In other words, very, highly, in many cases, highly convoluted technical solutions to politics, which some of them are okay. The first one, require everyone to vote, which they say is what happens in Australia. Isn't, voter turnout is an issue. Not a lot of people vote within this country, but these are hardly solutions, though. These are, again, I would say fairly superficial solutions to a lot of the problems that are going on here. For example, they do this in Australia. Australia is hardly, an ideal political society that I would point to. And the idea, how the idea works is that basically, you fine people if they don't vote. Is that a solution? More coercion? I think even if more people voted, first of all, you have to have, meaningful choices for people to vote for in elections, which goes into our political party system, which is a whole other issue. But even if you wanted to have a small scale, moderate reform of voting within this country, how about give people the day off to vote? One of the reasons why people don't vote more in this country is because they're working, especially lower income people. Statistics show that lower income people vote much less than, middle class or higher income people. Now, why is that? They just don't care about politics? Possibly, but probably a big reason for that, because they're working constantly, in some cases like two or three jobs. So they literally don't have time to vote, especially in areas where voting sites are spread, few and far between, and you have to wait, stand online for 2 hours to cast a vote or something like that. It's just not a practical means for many people. So again, if you wanted to get more people out to vote, which again, I'm not even saying is the number one solution that I would point to for what ails our political system, forcing people to vote is not the way I would go about it. There's certainly other ways that you can encourage people to vote besides literally fining them if they don't vote. Anyway, a new high school course, Identity 101. Because we don't talk enough about culture within this country already, that our politics isn't already completely consumed with so-called culture war issues. This person proposes that we spend even more time talking about culture. And this kind of identity politics, that kind of stuff. I mean, that often goes along with the kind of, ignorant attacks on, the classics and things like that I was talking about last class. I mean, those ideas often sort of go hand in hand with each other, not always. But we spend way too much time talking about culture already. I mean, it's essentially all politics is about now. It's just talking about different cultural signifiers and sort of, signaling your commitment to a set of values, either a liberal set of values or a more conservative set of values. And I would argue that the predominance of the culture war in our politics is an admission or at least a way of deflecting attention away from the fact that neither political party can offer anything to people in terms of actually, again, improving their material standard of living. Can't do anything about inequality within this country, can't do anything about, again, the high cost of living within this country, any of those things, which are far more important issues. They can't do anything. So in light of that, they simply just sort of shift the terrain of politics, shift the terrain of political debate into endless culture war issues. And again, this person wants to basically spend even more time talking about it. So I've already, this would be one of the primary examples of, a kind of idealist attempt to, focus away from the, the very real material issues that people have to deal with within this country. And, I should also point out that, again, many of these people, these may seem like short blurbs. Many of these people have written books and articles with these things as their thesis. So this does, kind of go a little bit more into at least what some, and 38 ideas is not an insignificant number. Obviously, there are more people that influence our political discourse than that, but, it's not an insignificant number either. So I would at least argue it gives you a pretty good sense of what a lot of the so-called, political elites in this country are talking about. This person talks about 1 month without social media. There's a lot of hostility towards, social media and fake news expressed here. Again, I'm not a fan of social media. I don't think it does very much good. I think it probably, undermines democracy more than strengthens it. But, going 1 month without it is again a very superficial idea. Befriend a libertarian, written by an editor-in-chief of a libertarian magazine. So basically, she's saying subscribe to my magazine. Basically, that's her solution for how to fix democracy within this country. Tackle tough subjects at dinner. A lot of people say that too. I got to kind of push back against that idea a little bit. I mean, I don't think arguing with your conservative relatives is necessarily the best thing. I don't see how that's going to save, or fix democracy within this country. Yes, I wish people would talk about politics more. I wish people were more political. But I got to say, the idea that you can talk about very complex political issues at the dinner table, that's not so easy to do, right? I mean, as somebody who literally talks about politics for a living, I like the fact that I have my PowerPoint and I can show graphs and things like that. It makes talking about these things a lot easier to do, especially if you're talking about more complicated issues related to capitalism and things like that. It's not so easy to do, at the dinner table when you're supposed to be having, your Thanksgiving dinner or something like that. Yeah, maybe if you're just talking about, abortion and things like that, and fairly no-brainer issues, fairly easy issues to talk about. Not to say that there aren't people who are opposed to these things, but making arguments for it shouldn't be that hard. Yeah, maybe you can do that, but we're talking more complicated issues. I'm not so sure that is easy to talk about at the dinner table. And again, I'm not sure if getting into fights with your conservative relatives is essentially a good thing either. Outlaw private education. Again, I'm not a fan of private education, but I mean, people should have the choice. I don't see how taking more choices away from people or coercing people to do things is going to help democracy either. Here's another right winger: ignore the cultural elite, who literally says that income inequality is not a big issue, when of course it is. And then he talks about how all these drug overdose deaths are happening, suicides and things like that. So you might, okay, well, this guy seems to have at least talking about an important issue. But what does he blame it on? Political correctness. That's why people are committing suicide and dying from drug overdoses, because of political correctness. Like, what is this guy even talking about? Who ruined marriage? Of course, referring to same-sex marriage. Who normalized drug use? Does he mean pharmaceutical companies? Because these people are so used to these arguments that perhaps they forgot that the leading cause of, I think, of drug overdose deaths within the United States now is from legally prescribed opioids, not from so-called street drugs anymore. And anyway, the government hasn't normalized drug use. I mean, in the eyes of the federal government, marijuana is still considered a dangerous drug. And of course, no state that I'm aware of has legalized any drug use other than marijuana. Who defended the rights of pornographers? I don't even know what he's talking about. Who celebrated transgression? Is that reference to trans people? I mean, or transgression more generally speaking? Who is responsible for ruining the lives of so many? Again, he's saying it's because of political correctness and relating this to suicide and drug. Again, you couldn't cut this guy off and maybe give a blurb to Noam Chomsky or somebody like that, or David Harvey or Michael Hudson or Richard Wolff or any number of other people. David Harvey is one of the most well-known Marxist theorists. He has a podcast now. He actually taught at the grad school that I went to, the CUNY Graduate Center in New York. He claims to have something like 300,000 citations, in the academic world or whatever, but can't get, an op-ed published by the New York Times. And, again, you see that, I think, expressed in this article as well. 38 ideas, not one, genuine, socialist point of view. Bring back the draft. That's a great idea. Or civilian service, so what, serve in the Peace Corps, I guess, or something like that. This is one of my favorite ones as far as bad ideas go. Allow garage unit rentals. So again, talks about, the rise in inequality, the gap in incomes and things like that. The solution for it is basically to allow rich people to rent out their garages to poor people. So you can live in Bill Gates's garage or something like that. And that's basically, the solution for the housing problem here within the United States. Not actually build public housing, not tax people, not tax landlords who warehouse their apartments, which is a real issue within New York City, and I would imagine in other cities as well, where warehousing is basically where landlords, not only are the units vacant, but they're not, being allowed to be rented out. The landlords are simply taking them off the market. I hate to use that term, the housing market, but that's what they're doing essentially, to basically bid up the price. When you restrict the supply of something, it tends to increase the price of things. So they're literally, withholding vacant housing in order to, increase the price of it. Because, rents in New York City aren't already, high enough, I guess. So don't do anything about that. Don't tax landlords who are doing things like that. Don't build, affordable public housing for people, which is a reality in many other countries. Here in the United States, public housing, if you say you live in a project or a housing project, has a very negative stigma attached to it. Not necessarily the case in many other countries, where you can actually have, somewhat decent public housing. Here in the United States, though, because of, the lack of, funding and things like that, public housing kind of has like a bad, like I said, stigma to it. But, don't do any of that. Just let, again, you can live downstairs from, or you can live in Bernie Marcus's, garage or something like that. Keep dreaming. Okay. A woman-led evangelical movement. I don't see what positive benefit would come out of that. Constitutional amendment on equality by Ibram X. Kendi, who, if you remember from the last article, was really attacked by the author of that article. Again, I'm not sure what their problem is with Kendi. Constitutional Amendment on equality, I mean, we kind of already have that with the 14th Amendment. And, again, just because something's written on a piece of paper doesn't necessarily, mean anything. Establish National Unity Week. So again, we should encourage people to feel more unified, even though like half the people in this country are fascists, basically. But again, another example of just, again, trying to change the way people think without changing the material circumstances in which they live in. Switch to instant runoff voting, another technocratic thing. Remind the government is beholden to us. This guy says limited government seems to be the best working model. Okay, but yet our democracy is completely screwed up, and we have a very limited government. So maybe that has something to do with it. Talks about high taxes, regulations. The United States has one of the lowest tax rates of any country in the world. Yet they never, get tired of complaining about the high taxes here, when we tax our people much less than most other countries do. And when people complain about limited government, the only part of the government they don't like is the part of the government that provides, financial aid to working people. I mean, that's it. They're okay with the bloated military budget. They're okay with the Gestapo-like police forces that we have here and the surveillance state and all that other stuff. They're okay with all that. But, food stamps and Medicaid, that's the part of the stuff they don't like. Rein in the Congressional Budget Office, teach critical thinking, give every teen a black box, okay? Fund art centers. Again, I'm in favor of that idea, but is that really going to fix, the issue here? I mean, this is what I mean about these just incredibly shallow, superficial ideas written by very, prominent people. Push for civil rights, education, prevent left-wing media bias. Another, two contributors from Reason magazine, a right-wing libertarian magazine that probably nobody reads, yet they have two people contributing little blurbs here. Anyway, the Post is doing this. They are preventing left-wing media bias because they don't have any socialists, weighing in here. Let government co-own new technologies by Danny Roderick, and a pretty prominent economist. Again, interesting idea, but not exactly, the most important thing I would think of, at least. Redefine the flag, meaningless. Stop obsessing about white privilege, by John McWhorter, who happens to be black, by the way. White privilege is a thing. Maybe not the only thing that matters, but it certainly is a thing. End the blame game. That's all that they say. Just this tiny little fragment right here. So we should blame ourselves, as this piece indicates, I guess, rather than blaming other people. I mean, what about capitalism? I mean, capitalism is not a person, but capitalism is not even necessarily something that you can blame. It's really about, understanding the way in which the system works and the consequences of that. Celebrate government, peer review for candidates, a Marshall Plan for America. Now, this is another one that may at first sound like a good idea. The Marshall Plan, this massive reconstruction effort after World War II to rebuild Europe. But that's not actually what the person has in mind. They're not talking about spending trillions of dollars to modernize the infrastructure within the United States or spend more money on schools or anything like that. They're talking about promoting a concept of good citizenship, to encourage, as it says somewhere, listening, empathy, and compassion. Again, another prime example of what I'm talking about: changing ideas without actually changing material circumstances. And that's not what the Marshall Plan was about. So it's a very misleading idea as well. This is one of the worst ones. Create a system of voting credits. I defy anyone to actually read this and explain to me what the hell this guy is talking about. He talks about political markets and says that it's the weakness of this term. Well, maybe the weakness of the term stems from the fact that politics should not be understood as a kind of market economy. But that's not what he's talking about. In fact, that's the actual, again, the subject of this book that he co-wrote, Radical Markets. I'm sure there's some real radical solutions here. There is a solution. Imagine all citizens are allocated equal budget consisting of an artificial currency credits. You obtain this budget when you reach a voting age. I mean, try reading this and explain to me what the hell this guy is talking about. So this would create a kind of auction system for political markets. Because of the limited budget, people would be forced to spend more credits on candidates on issues they really care about and fewer on others. I mean, this by far I think is the most convoluted idea. I'm sure if I spent more time reading it, I could figure it out. But is it really worth the effort? And anyway, it seems to be sort of watering the idea of like one person, one vote. That apparently like your votes would count for more than other people would in certain circumstances. Public education, great. Okay, great. George Takei weighs in here, the guy from Star Trek. Local government, gun insurance. So let's not put restrictions on guns. Let's just force everyone to buy insurance on their guns. End American arrogance. Okay, well, how do you do that? Grassroots revolt against fake news. Again, another, fake news, social media. Revive human decency. Again, changing people's ideas without, again, I'm repeating myself. Bring back the Cold War economy. Well, we are doing that, in fact, with Russia and China. So I'm sure they're happy about that. Persuade voters to keep clicking. Cultivate national gratefulness. And this is the last one. And again, speaks to the point I've already made. Fitting that it comes from the National Endowment for Democracy, which is basically a CIA front organization, which is, again, a fitting way to end this article because many people believe that the Washington Post and the New York Times basically, now function as conduits for the CIA and the Pentagon to basically, transmit information to the public. So that's it. That's the entirety of this article. Pretty crappy. Again, speaks to my point. There is no, authentic Tribune within the United States. And that's kind of picking up, where I sort of ended last class. So now let me switch over to the PowerPoint. And again, this is the part of the play where the Tribunes, Act 2 and Act 3, where the Tribunes sort of play the biggest role, I would say, right? Are most sort of instrumental to the plot here. So again, as I mentioned last class, all hell basically breaks loose. So if you remember, Act 2 ends basically. Coriolanus thinks he's about to be confirmed as consul by the people, who he very reluctantly went before to speak to. The Tribune sort of stepped in after he left and kind of, swayed the people to go another way. And now, as he's about to, as he thinks he's about to be confirmed to become consul, he realizes that the people have actually turned on him, and he does not take it well. So he talks a lot of shit about the Tribunes. He, behold, these are the Tribunes of the people, the tongues of the common mouth. I do despise them, which we all know he does, for they do prank them in authority against all noble sufferance. You show too much of that, for which the people stir. If you will pass to where you are bound, you must inquire your way, which you are out of with a gentler spirit, or never be so noble as a consul, nor yoke with him for tribute. Basically saying, you're too arrogant, basically. Now here's an interesting. So now he realizes what's going on, and again things escalate from here. And he says, "Look, I mean, these people have way too much power. In fact, these people should not have any power." This is Coriolanus speaking, of course. He says, "Now as I live, I will. My nobler friends, I crave their pardons." Meaning, he of the upper class, the Senate. For the mutable rank-scented many, let them regard me as I do not flatter, and therein behold themselves. I say again, in soothing them we nourish against our Senate the cockle of rebellion, insolence, sedition, which we ourselves have plowed for, sowed, and scattered, by mingling them with us the honored number, who lack not virtue, no, nor power, but that which they have given to beggars. So he's saying we've basically given these people, like I said, too much power. We're sort of feeding their rebellious instincts basically against our Senate, and we need to basically put a stop to this. These people are beggars. Why should we listen to them? Now, when he says this, essentially he's saying that there's too much democracy now within Rome. Now, when he says this reminds me, again, if I can relate this to something more contemporary, reminds me of something known as the Powell Memo, written in the 1970s. Written by Lewis F. Powell Jr., a lawyer and corporate executive. Let me make this a little bit smaller so I can read this. In 1971, the memo was written for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and addressed to its members. Powell urged businesses and corporations to counter increasing liberalism in the United States. In other words, he believed that there was, again, too much democracy within the United States. So a very similar sentiment, I would say, to what's being expressed by Coriolanus here. The idea that the commoners, the rabble, we've given these people too much power and they're basically ruining everything. We need to put these people back in their place. We need to take power away from them. And, had Coriolanus, been a corporate lawyer, I guess, like Lewis Powell, who later served on the Supreme Court, by the way, possibly could have thought of a way to actually accomplish that goal, which has happened basically in the United States since the 1970s. So Powell urged them to create think tanks, fund academic research, and establish media outlets to promote their ideas and values. So, for example, the founder of Fox News, Roger Ailes, who worked for the Nixon administration, going back to this period of time in the 1970s, already sort of envisioned an idea for kind of, conservative news network, which he thought would compete with the more, mainstream, liberal news media. So these ideas were very much floating around in the 1970s. Now, if you look at this within America, within an American context, again, the Powell memo dates from 1971. This is just a few years, basically, after the Civil Rights Movement, after the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act are passed. Certainly, that seems to be the implication here. Is that now you have African American people, really for the first time expressing their right to vote, wielding some kind of political power. We got to put a stop to that, and not just to that, but you have the women's liberation movement. You have the early gay rights movement beginning to develop. You have the anti-war movement. Labor unions are still very strong in the early 1970s. So I think Powell basically had all these groups in mind, and so all of them basically as attaining too much power. And again, the elites, much like again, Coriolanus talking about the Senate and the oligarchs within Rome. That they have to sort of take the power back basically, and put these people in their place. Now, it did eventually happen in Rome, but not for a couple of hundred years. In the United States, it happened much quicker. Within a couple of decades, basically, or even from the 1970s to the 1980s. Now, Powell was later put on the Supreme Court, like I said, by Richard Nixon. One of the decisions that he weighed in on is the Buckley v. Vallejo Supreme Court case from 1976. This is the case that essentially equates money with freedom of speech. It's one of the worst Supreme Court cases in the history of the court, and that is kind of saying something because there are a lot of bad decisions made by the court over the years. But this is essentially the one that sort of opened the floodgates to spending unlimited amounts of money in election campaigns, equating it again, as it says, with freedom of speech. So Powell himself wrote, "The First Amendment requires the invalidation of any legislative effort to regulate the content of political speech," meaning money. That's what he really means, spending on political ads, basically, based on a fear that people would hear or read too much of it. It was a closely decided case. The minority members of the court, including the Thurgood Marshall and a few others, basically realized that, yes, this is not, a proper usage of the First Amendment, that, allowing rich people to spend as much money as they want in political campaigns and to create political ads actually narrows the range of political speech. It does not actually broaden it. It essentially allows, wealthy people to monopolize political debate within this country, which of course has happened. And again, this is something that Powell himself, played a very important role in. Now, again, Powell addressed his memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Let me come back here for a second. To the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, you can see that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is one of the biggest spenders on political campaigns. especially this is a chart listing what they call dark money, which is money you don't even know where the money is coming from. The donors are not disclosed in many cases or most cases, so you don't even know where the money is coming from. But if you look at the top spenders here, I mean, these are basically all conservative groups. Crossroads GPS was founded by Karl Rove, chief political advisor to George W. Bush. Americans for Prosperity, I believe, is the Koch brothers Foundation, the National Rifle Association. Again, as far as I know, pretty much most of these are conservative groups. You have Planned Parenthood coming here at the very bottom. So perhaps Coriolanus should have had something like this in mind. Maybe he wouldn't have been so upset about democracy in Rome. Now, again, according to people like Michael Hudson, by the time you get to the last days of the Roman Republic, the tribunes had essentially been either, bought off, corrupted, or basically murdered by the Roman oligarchs. So that kind of paved the way for their consolidation of power as well. So but again, at least it took a much longer period of time within Rome. It happened very shortly within the United States. Anyway, so again, Coriolanus goes back to why he feels that he has, authority here, or why he should have more of a voice. He says, "As for my country, I have shed my blood, not fearing outward force. So shall my lungs coin words till their decay against those measles, which we disdain should tether us, yet sought the very way to catch them." So he compares the people to measles, basically. The tribunes chime back. "You speak, the people, as if you were a god to punish, not a man of their infirmity." Now, Coriolanus did at least, fight in actual battles and things like that. So you could at least argue that he was, genuinely protecting Rome from foreign threats. People today who make these claims, what exactly is what foreign threats does the United States need protection from? I mean, we're not any real danger of invasion or anything like that. I would argue that basically every war the U.S. has fought since World War II, at least, cannot really be a justifiable war. And that is saying something, because we fought a lot of wars and certainly intervened in a lot of foreign conflicts since then. Now, as far as the tribunes go, Sicinius and Brutus, I'm curious. I wonder how people see these characters, because they don't, for the most part, seem like very reputable characters. They come across like schemers, basically, and very underhanded people. But I feel like a lot of what they say seems to make sense, and a lot of the points that they make against Coriolanus seem to be true. I mean, after all, what they're saying about him is that, you speak of the people basically as if you were better than them. I mean, that's correct, isn't it? I mean, what they're saying is not exactly false. Later on they say, what is the city but the people, which of course is also true. Anyway, he replies, I'll give my reasons more worthier than their voices. They know the corn. So he's referring to this earlier conflict where the people were starving and the government did not distribute corn to them. They know the corn was not our recompense, resting well assured. They ne'er did service for it, being pressed to the war. Even when the navel of the state was touched, they would not thread the gates. This kind of service did not deserve corn gratis, meaning for free. And Coriolanus time and time again comes back to this idea that the people are not willing to fight for Rome. Now, is that true? Now, in the famous first act, the climax of that act, at least, was Coriolanus, fighting almost single-handedly against the Volscians. I mean, that is not typical for battles during this period of time or afterwards. Coriolanus apparently never heard the phrase, a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. This idea that the poor people don't fight in wars and battles, I mean, what is that based upon? Doesn't seem to make any sense. What that phrase means, which basically comes out of the 1960s and the Vietnam War, is that this was a war. The decision to go to war and those who are arguably benefiting from the war are the wealthy, while it's the poor, whether they're living in cities or whether they're living in rural areas within the country, that are actually the ones doing the fighting. That was true during the Vietnam War. As far as I know, that's basically true during, essentially every war that has ever been fought. So I'm not sure what Coriolanus is basing this on. He says that the people don't deserve food because they're not willing to fight for the state. That certainly is contrary to the actual, experience or the actual historical record of Rome. So is he kind of deluding himself here to a certain extent? I think so. Or again, sort of taking the exceptional circumstances that he represents and sort of, acting like that is typical. Most of the Roman generals and elite and commanders were not actually, doing a lot of, hand-to-hand fighting back then. Okay. So again, they're saying, what is the city but the people? And of course, again, they're correct. By the consent of all, we were established the people's magistrate. So again, the idea of government by consent, very important idea. That is the way to lay the city flat, to bring the roof to the foundation, and bury all which yet distinctly ranges in heaps and piles of ruin. Now, this is basically their response to the tribunes, basically saying, well, you want to elevate yourself. You want to put yourself on the same level as us, which is, again, a very common argument that's made. Now, this is the Taparian rock. So the scene basically ends with the plebs basically calling for Coriolanus to be executed, to be thrown off this rock, which was a real, if you can see, if you get launched off the top of this thing, you're probably not going to survive. And this was an actual real method of execution for traitors back then. They would actually hurl your ass off this giant cliff. So that's the end of scene one. So scene two, they kind of take a power. All right, let's back off here. Let's calm things down. Volumina tries to counsel her son, basically saying, yes, I know you hate these people. I do too. But let's be smart about this. As she says, pray be counseled. I have a heart as little apt as yours. Meaning, I don't care for these people either. But yet a brain that leads my use of anger to better advantage. She's basically saying, pick and choose your battles. It's not worth, fighting over this. You are too absolute, though therein you can never be too noble. But when extremities speak, I've heard you say honor and policy like unsevered friends. In the war do grow together. Grant that and tell me in peace what each of them by the other lose, that they combine not there. So again, she's trying to counsel him. I've heard you talk about this during, fighting. Try to apply your sort of strategic mind to this conflict as well. But he's not really, able to do that. I mean, they kind of calm him down. And Menenius is there. But again, scene three, they sort of go back in front of the people. And again, things very quickly, decline. So the tribunes, again, you can see them kind of plotting and scheming a little bit here. They're kind of coordinating what they're going to do. They know that their power rests in the fact that they have the people behind them. That they can sort of call upon the collective force of the people who can sort of all raise their voice as one, and that is a very powerful force. It's very hard to resist that or go against something like that when you have a whole crowd of people basically clamoring for something. But you see them kind of organizing things, right? Sort of coordinating things to get basically the reaction that they want. So they say in this point charge. So basically planning before Coriolanus gets on the scene. In this part, charge him that he affects tyrannical power. If he evade us there, enforce him with his envy to the people, and that the spoil got on the Antiates was ne'er distributed. So they're basically, okay, if this tactic doesn't work, then we're going to try this one, then we're going to try that one. Interestingly enough, they accuse him of aspiring to kingship or aspiring to be a tyrant. As we know, from people like Michael Hudson, the tyrants in ancient times were usually people who tried to curry the favor of the people by canceling debts and things like this. Coriolanus seems to go the opposite route. His attempt to aspire to kingship is to alienate the people as much as he possibly can. And this is essentially the charge that they made against Julius Caesar as well. That Caesar was trying to sort of curry favor with the people by canceling their debts and things like that. By the way, if I ever pointed this out, the setting of this play takes place, like 400 years before, more than 400 years before the events of Julius Caesar. So a long time. It's very easy to sort of compress the period of time that we refer to as antiquity into not really see the differences or distinctions between them. But actually there is a significant amount of time between the events of the two plays. Anyway, assembly presently the people hither, and when they hear me say, it shall be so, in the right and strength, oh, the commons, be it either for death, for fine, or banishment, then let them. If I say fine, cry fine. If death, cry death, insisting on the old prerogative and power in the truth of the cause. So again, coordinating things. So when they're brought face to face, the tribunes quickly accuse him of being a traitor. Menenius tries to rein in Coriolanus, does not go so well, right? Coriolanus immediately explodes. The fires in the lowest hell fold in the people. Call me their traitor, thou injurious tribune. With thine eyes sat 20,000 deaths. In thy hands clutched as many millions. In thy lying tongue, both numbers, I would say. Thou liest unto thee with a voice as free as I do pray the gods. The plebs, again, call for his death, but he is banished instead. They basically, kick him out of Rome. And Coriolanus basically says he's going to banish them. He's like saying, you can't fire me. I quit, basically. And that's kind of how the act ends. And then Act 4 will then pick up as Coriolanus basically leaves the city. So, last class I wanted to get through Acts 2 and 3. I didn't get a chance to. So this would be sort of how I would have started today's class if I had gotten through Act 3 last class. But I thought it'd be interesting to point a little bit about the philosopher Hegel and what he says about Shakespeare. He considered Shakespeare to be the greatest of all playwrights. And Hegel is an interesting thinker in his own right, played a strong influence on Marx, particularly in the idea of the dialectic, which is taken over by Marx. Although Hegel, again, would be an example of an idealist philosopher, whereas Marx saw himself, sort of correcting Hegel by sort of taking this idea in a more materialist direction. Hence the term historical materialism, or sometimes dialectical materialism to refer to Marx's approach. But Hegel did write, pretty extensively about Shakespeare, mainly in his lectures, which were published in book form after his death. Let me make this smaller. Again, according to Hegel, Shakespeare is the greatest playwright of all time, and his works represented the highest achievement of human culture. Hegel believed that Shakespeare's plays embodied the highest form of artistic expression, and that they captured the deepest truths about human nature. And for Hegel, the ability for art to express truth was a very important thing. Hegel saw Shakespeare as a master of character development, and he believed that his plays were able to convey complex ideas and emotions in a way that was both profound and accessible. And I think that accessibility aspect is important as well. Too many times, in other words, Shakespeare is a brilliant writer, and his ideas are sophisticated, but not so much so that it was, that outside the realm of understanding of the average person. I say that because too many artists, today it seems like, especially artists who consider themselves to be avant-garde, accessibility seems to rank very low among their approach to art. And, we end up sort of, groping about these things like the apes in 2001: A Space Odyssey, when they see the black monolith, and it's this thing that's, barely comprehensible to us. Shakespeare did not have that problem, right? His works were, again, profound and deep, but also accessible at the same time. Hegel also saw Shakespeare's works as embodying the spirit of the age. Again, another key idea tied to Hegel, in which they were written, and he believed that they represented a kind of universal human experience that was relevant to all people at all times and places. Now, again, as I mentioned in the last article, in the article from last class, there's been a significant backlash against this idea of universal values and things like that. But from what I can tell, based on the students' writings on these things, most people do feel that way. And yes, there are profound social and cultural differences that separate people, but I think there are still universal human experiences that people have: love and death and suffering and things like that. I mean, I don't see why it's a controversial thing to say things like that. Now, how we experience those things, of course, differ, but there is a kind of commonality to those things at the same time. Hegel also writes a lot about this idea of form and content. So according to him, form and content are two essential elements of any work of art or literature. The content refers to the subject matter or the ideas that the work is meant to convey, while the form refers to the way in which those ideas are expressed or presented. Hegel believed that the relationship between form and content was a dialectical one. Again, another key idea of Hegel, meaning that they are in constant interaction with one another. He argued that the form of a work of art or literature is not merely a passive vehicle for the content, but that it actively shapes and influences the way in which the content is perceived and understood. For Hegel, the ideal work of art would be one in which the form and content were perfectly harmonized, which he believed that Shakespeare did. By the way, Shakespeare is one of the few artists, at least in Hegel's day, up to Hegel's day, that was able to achieve that kind of what he would call perfect synthesis of form and content, so that the form would enhance and deepen the meaning of the content. He believed that this kind of artistic synthesis was the highest achievement of human culture, and that it was capable of conveying profound truths about the human experience. Again, all ideas which I think are still relevant now. Particularly, it's interesting how you approach this idea of so-called form and content, which, if you think of it in basic terms, again, the content refers to the meaning of the ideas. The form refers to how those ideas are presented to people, and arguing that Shakespeare was basically a master at both. As far as a way of sort of critiquing and evaluating art, I think it is an interesting way to approach it, because it's easy enough to imagine works of art that, would fall short in one or other categories. For example, you could imagine works of art that are highly developed in a formal sense, meaning the sort of technical skills of the artist, but don't have a lot to say, don't really express any profound truths or anything like that, which I said is important to Hegel as well. On the other hand, you could think of works that may have important content, may speak to very important ideas, but maybe are not as technically polished as something else. So it is an interesting way to approach art. Now, this is Hegel's way of approaching art. Again, he places a very big emphasis on truth. To him, the idea of beauty in art was objective as well, meaning if you look at Kant, for example, the philosopher Kant, beauty is a very subjective experience. The experience of beauty, he says, may be a universal thing, but how we actually experience or what object we find beautiful, Kant would say, is subjective. Hegel would say that beauty is objective. It's sort of located in the sort of truth content of the art. Anyway, lots of other philosophical figures have written on Shakespeare, and it's interesting because they all sort of give their own kind of unique emphasis on it. For Hegel, it's things like again, truth, the unity of form and content, objective spirit, all sort of key Hegelian ideas. Again, for Kant, it's much more of a subjective experience. For Heidegger, Shakespeare's greatness lies in his understanding of being and his authenticity. For Nietzsche, it's his ability to subvert conventional morals. For Foucault, it's how power operates in society. The Marxist literary critic Terry Eagleton says that Shakespeare understands class dynamics. The transition from feudalism to capitalism is a voice for the oppressed. So each of these philosophical figures or literary figures offers their own sort of emphasis, which if you know anything about these thinkers, are very characteristic of their own way of thinking. But what they all basically agree upon are the following things: the complex characters, the way in which Shakespeare builds dramatic tension, his mastery of language. Those are all things that are basically almost universally agreed upon. And again, going back to the article from last class, it really shows you the profound ignorance of people that have such a hostile attitude towards the classics, and Shakespeare in particular. Because again, not only are you going up against the legacy of Shakespeare himself, and what I would argue is the self-evident brilliance of his work, but you're also going up against the 400-year legacy of other thinkers and writers that have all already testified to his brilliance, including some of the most important African American writers. James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, Richard Wright, Lorraine Hansberry. I could go on. And of course, writers in other contexts as well, in Africa, in other parts of the world. So you're going up against all of that. And it really shows you really how, in over their head, these people are when they think that they're going to, make an argument why Shakespeare doesn't matter anymore or something like that, or that you're not going to miss out on anything if you don't read him, which is literally what some person said. All right, so and I think as far as his mastery of the dramatic form and things like that, I think this is a good place to sort of put that, because I would argue again that at the end of Act 3 is basically the climax of the play. This is where things sort of reach its highest dramatic intensity, much like in Julius Caesar, like I already said. The murder of Caesar in Act 3 is the climax of the play. What happens afterwards is sort of the come down phase, or the sort of the logical conclusion of what happens afterwards. I think this play sort of follows a similar structure in that regard. And I think it is true. I think Shakespeare clearly is a master of the dramatic form. He's a master of building tension through the interaction of characters and things like that. Not just by relying on action scenes, and explosions and things like that, which we come to associate now with modern day film and artistic works and things like that. But through the interaction of these different characters, and the excitement comes from the tension that sort of exists between these different characters and what they represent. So, okay, I think I pretty much covered everything I want to say about that. So again, so we've reached the climax of the play. Now things are kind of winding down, sort of almost reaching their kind of logical conclusion in many ways. So Act 4, Coriolanus leaves Rome. Well, Act 4, scene 1. He refers to the people as the beast with many heads butts me away. Scene 2. So scene 1 is basically his goodbye from his mother and his wife. Scene 2, again, you see the tribunes talking amongst themselves before being confronted by Volumina and Virgilia. Now they say amongst each other before the women come. He's referring to the Roman Senate. Now we have shown our power. Let us seem humbler after it is done than when it was a doing. They're not just motivated, I would say, by envy, the way that maybe Cassius is against Caesar. They're not just trying to, they don't just envy Coriolanus. It's not clear if they envy him at all, in fact, but they simply are thinking, like, how do we, increase our power, basically? How do we increase the power? I'm sure they're doing it for self-interested motives, but they're also, how do we increase the power of the people? How do we increase the power of the tribunes, our political offices, relative to the other, institutions within Rome? That seems to be their real motivation here. And then, of course, they do get into, a confrontation with Coriolanus's wife and mother, who are two different people, not the same. And, they kind of, tell them off, basically. Now, in scene 3, it says that it's a Roman talking to a Volscian. I would imagine that this is Coriolanus, even though he's not referred to that in this scene, at least. In the very next scene, you see him showing up in disguise. His identity is concealed. It's not clearly said that this is the same person in scene 3, but I would imagine it is. And again, anyway, he, on a highway, on a road, basically encounters a, Volscian, scout or watchman. And he's basically, again, proposing that Aufidius, who you first encountered in the first act of the play, makes a deal with Coriolanus. He says, I've heard it said that the fittest time to corrupt a man's wife is when she's fallen out with her husband. Your noble Tullus Aufidius will appear well in these wars, his great opposer Coriolanus being now in no request of his country. Basically saying, in other words, Coriolanus is the wife here in this passage, and basically saying, look, Coriolanus has had a falling out with her husband, Rome, and now this is the best time that you can sort of, get him on your side, essentially. Then scene 4, he comes to Antium, the city, from the outside, or outside the city walls. He recognizes that, I was, literally here, killing people not too long ago. Now I'm basically going here to basically appeal to them for aid. 'Tis I that made thy widows many an heir of these fair edifices for my wars. Have I heard groan and drop? They know me not, lest that thy wives with spits and boys with stones in puny battle slay me. He's basically, I've made so many women a widow and children orphans that, they may come out and try to kill me, basically. But he's willing to accept it. He's willing to just. I mean, what else is he going to do? He's been banished from Rome. Banishment, or as the Greeks would call it, ostracism, what was essentially like a death sentence back then. I mean, if you were, thrown out of the city, it's very unlikely that you would be able to survive for very long. Now, Coriolanus is a man of means, and presumably has some wealth and property. Maybe that's taken away from him. Maybe he didn't have that much, but apparently that's not an option for him. So he literally goes to the enemy camp. He goes to the city of the enemy, who he was literally, again, fighting not too long ago. Now, I selected this passage here. It's an interesting, passage that speaks to the, the twist of fate that many people go through in life. I took this out mainly because this is, I think, the only real example that Coriolanus gives of a monologue. So as I mentioned, Coriolanus is often considered one of the more enigmatic Shakespearean characters. And one of the reasons for that is because you don't really get many glimpses into his inner life. You don't really get many glimpses into what he's thinking. He doesn't speak in monologues. Again, if I'm not mistaken, I think this is the only example in the entire play that he gives of a monologue, that where he does a monologue. So he says, "O world, thy slippery turns, friends now fast sworn, whose double bosoms seem to wear one heart, whose hours, whose bed, whose meal and exercise are still together, who twin as 'twere in love, inseparable, shall within this hour, on a dissension of a doit, break out to bitterest enmity. So fellest foes, whose passions and whose plots have broke their sleep, to take the one the other by some chance, some trick not worth an egg, shall grow dear friends, and interjoin their issues. So with me, my birthplace hate I, and my love's upon this enemy town I'll enter, if he slay me. He does fair justice. If he give me way, I'll do his country service." So basically saying, like I said, twist of fate. My friends are now my enemies. My enemies are now my friends, or at least I'm going to, appeal to them to be friends. I had what he considers to be a small falling out with his former friends, now basically led to him being, exiled from the city. And now again, he's basically forced to appeal to his former enemies, if he can, be of some use to them. Again, as far as I can tell, the only example of a monologue that Coriolanus gives. Yeah, Jerome.
That's interesting in my opinion, because you really feel he sort of is connected and detached from the possibility of death. He's like, oh, well, if they kill me, well, he does justice, but I can serve them well. So there's really something of a soldier of fortune, I feel. Like he's really detached from anything. He's just here to fight. And that really brings us to the notion of pure warrior. It was the term that you used at the beginning of the class. And I think that really, captures very well the nature of Coriolanus. Just fighting and quite detached from death, from ideology, and that kind of things.
Yeah, he's basically just, kind of like a fighting machine. I mean, that's essentially what his purpose is. That's all he's essentially good at. Now, Coriolanus, I'm assuming by this point, everyone has read the play in full. So not much of a surprise, Coriolanus dies at the end. And usually, when tragic characters are meet their final fate, it's usually because of some so-called tragic flaw that they possess. And it's quite curious to question what seems to be Coriolanus's tragic flaw. I mean, clearly it seems to be pride, his prideful nature, his disdain for the commoners. But at what moment does that sort of really set things into motion? The final results of the play. I mean, it's not his banishment, I would say, per se. It's not even that he couldn't sort of adopt the false modesty to appeal to the plebs in the market, which again is another very interesting scene. It kind of says a lot about politics, right? Even now, of course, this kind of, false humility, false modesty, lots of politicians adopt this kind of phony populism that a lot of them adopt. I mean, you very much see evidence of that now, and obviously was common practice back then as well. He's not willing to do that. But I would say what really sort of does him in is the decision to make him a consul. I mean, he's simply not a person well suited for that office. But you wonder if it's even really a choice that he makes, or if it's just kind of an expectation that if you are a great military leader, then of course you're supposed to seek political office. Almost like it's like a foregone conclusion. And that I would argue, at least this seems to be what was sort of, sets, the chain of events into motion, which basically, leads to his end, is that he never should have, been proposed for a consul. He never should have sought political office. And again, it's not even quite clear that he seems to want to do it. It just seems to be kind of an expectation that he has to do it, that you are a great leader. This is what you do. And again, as I talked about last class, I mean, you certainly see that playing out. Yeah, Jerome.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting because, as you said, in most tragedies, people brought it on themselves. Here is like, it's not really like, if you take Macbeth, Macbeth is also kind of persuaded by Lady Macbeth as well. But here you really feel that he's completely how shall I put it? He's not very much in control of the forces around him. People say, yeah, become a consul. And he's like, I don't care about it. And
right.
You don't really feel that himself that he threw himself in the grave. It's not only his fault, it's his fault. Like he did not give the first push, if I could say so.
Yeah, I mean, last class again, I spoke of this kind of ritualistic nature of politics, that you just sort of go through these rituals. Like the citizens know that Coriolanus is going to go there. They pretty much know what he's going to say, or at least have an idea of what he's supposed to say and how he's supposed to act. So there's a sense that you're just sort of going through the motions and just sort of going through these formalities. I mean, in many ways, that seems to be what gets Coriolanus into trouble, is that he's just sort of going through the formality of now, okay, well, now I was, a victor in battle, so now I got to become consul. And yeah, it doesn't seem like something he's lusting after for. Macbeth very much seems to have a lust for power that Coriolanus does not have, and many other characters, display that kind of lust for power. He doesn't really seem to have. He just wants to fight, basically. But there's, again, this expectation that he's supposed to do that. And again, I think that's essentially what sort of, leads him to his ultimate fate. Now, again, there is a long history of military leaders serving as political leaders. You see it in the United States: Washington, Jackson, Grant, Eisenhower, very important military leaders in American history who served as president. Charles de Gaulle, many other examples, obviously. But, things kind of play out differently. Although you could certainly argue that these military leaders oftentimes do not make great political leaders. People often say that about Grant, for example. Which is interesting because there seems to be somewhat of a reevaluation of Grant's presidency after the Civil War. For many years, it was considered to be one of the worst presidential administrations in history. And again, that's kind of saying something. Synonymous with corruption. But many people have now sort of reevaluated that to some extent, that well, no, actually the Grant administration did maintain a commitment to Reconstruction after the Civil War. The Grant was willing to use military force against the Ku Klux Klan, which was developing obviously after the Civil War as well. So some people have kind of reevaluated some aspects of that. it's interesting because Grant is identified with corruption, or his administration is identified with corruption. People basically make the same argument about Reconstruction. The Reconstruction era in American history is a very controversial era, right? Many people, there was a school of history in the United States known as the Dunning School of History, around these Columbia University professors, the late 19th century, which sort of established the dominant narrative that Reconstruction, the Reconstruction was just this horrible thing, which trampled on the rights of the poor Southerners, the poor slave owners, basically. That it was characterized by corruption and all these other distasteful things. Other people, including W.E.B. Du Bois, the more contemporary historian Eric Foner, have written interesting books about the history of Reconstruction in America, and argue that, well, maybe there was corruption, but I mean, it certainly wasn't any more corrupt than any other era in American history, and possibly even less so. That there was at least, again, for a period of time, at least a sincere effort to, actually, empower, the newly freed slaves, and that, and then again, that the Grant administration played a role in that. So there has been some maybe, limited reevaluation or revision of Grant. Washington and Jackson, of course, were for many years considered to be great political leaders as well as generals. Eisenhower was considered to be a great president, or at least a fairly stable president. So maybe I'm kind of wrong, as I say. Maybe the idea that there is not a good relationship between being a military leader and a political leader certainly depends on your point of view, at least. Whether or not Andrew Jackson was a great president certainly depends upon your point of view. Some people think he was horrible, of course, but for many years he was considered to be a great president, a powerful president at the very least. Washington as well. I think you made the point last class that de Gaulle was maybe more successful as a political leader than a military leader, which is an interesting argument as well. Anyway, going back to the play, I mean, I think it's quite clear that Coriolanus is, I made this point, of course, last class, but is a horrible choice to be consul of Rome. And again, it doesn't even seem to be something that he wants to do, but because of, I wouldn't call it fate, but maybe because of the ritualistic nature of politics, is sort of forced into it to a certain extent. And yes, his natural personality and his disdain for the commoners and things like that certainly seals his fate as well. Interestingly enough, in scene 5, where he's now inside of Aufidius's house, Coriolanus almost immediately gets into another fight with the servants. So he just can't get along with the commoners, basically. And of course, yes, he's asking around. They're kind of shooing him away. He doesn't back down, but it does even indicate in the play, he's kind of pushing them around and things like that. So he's almost immediately getting to another fight. At this point, of course, Aufidius comes into the room. They make peace. Coriolanus makes this great appeal to him. I don't have it here because it's somewhat long, but he basically throws himself essentially on Aufidius's mercy. He accepts it. They seem to have this reconciliation. They were former enemies, of course, former opposing commanders for each other's army, which they seem to make peace and become friendly. After they leave, however, the servants talk to each other. There's 3 of them, and what they say, I think, is probably maybe the most interesting part about this particular scene. One of them suggests that peace. They essentially seem to be arguing that war is good because it sort of gets people unified, essentially on the same page with each other. And that peace actually makes men hate each other. That's something that's actually said. And then the next one follows up. He says, reason because they then less need one another. The war is for my money. Basically saying, yeah, war is good. I hope to see Romans as cheap as Volscians. They are rising. And it's an interesting idea. I mean, peace makes people hate each other. It's an interesting idea, certainly not a common sentiment that's often expressed, but a reason for it. He says, yes, because then they don't need each other as much. So it's an interesting argument for why people fight wars. I don't have the quote right here, but there's a very great quote by the historian. Where is it? You know what? It's probably worth finding. Bear with me 1 second. Okay. But he basically talks about how, war is sort of a unifying force, how it sort of helps political elites sort of, you know, um, cover up social divisions at home. Let me see if I can find the quote real quick. Okay. Yeah, it's Arno Mayer. Let me see. I think I could just copy and paste this here. Um, I'll add it to the slides. Yes, this is from the historian Arno Mayer. So he says, writing basically about the First World War, in fact, but this could obviously be applied to many other circumstances. He writes, strained and unstable internal conditions tend to make elites markedly intransigent and disposed to exceptionally drastic, not to say extravagantly hazardous preemptive solutions. So that's basically him saying that, domestic unrest is basically more likely to make elites start wars, basically to prevent social conflict from basically bubbling over into kind of a revolutionary situation. Beleaguered and vulnerable governments and political classes are more likely to be disposed for than against recourse to mounting external conflict or war. By both reflex and calculation, they assume that the members of a seriously torn polity and society will pull together once they are confronted with a common and imminent external threat and foe. Such governments incline to use heightened external conflict or war as an instrument of internal social cohesion, as an antidote to insurrection, revolution, civil war, or secession that they claim to be imminent. The ultimate objective is to monetize a striking diplomatic or military victory to restore, preferably to enhance, the waning power and prestige of internally enfeebled regimes, governments, and elites. So again, I think this kind of speaks to this idea that, war is a good thing because otherwise the people hate each other. But in a more sophisticated sense, that, it leads to, class, the absence of war. If you don't have sort of a common enemy to mobilize against, it makes it more likely that, class conflict, civil war, things like that will break out. Now, again, Mayer is writing this about the First World War, and it's essentially his thesis for what led to the First World War. It's kind of an interesting argument because it goes against the, conventional wisdom of national conflicts, or even, the Marxist argument of, imperialistic rivalry, but basically looks to the source of this in domestic political conflict. So basically, governments, the leading, European powers at this time were all facing, significant internal conflict. England, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and that the war is basically a way for them to sort of, suppress those domestic conflicts and basically, get people focusing on a common enemy, which of course led to the deaths of millions of people. And even in the United States, when the U.S. got into war, that, basically led to what is now known as really as the first Red Scare within the United States. The crackdown against, socialists and anarchists within the United States during that period of time, we often associate the Red Scare with McCarthyism in the 1950s, or even the Hollywood blacklist in the late 1940s. But now people refer to this period of time, around the First World War, as the first Red Scares. Especially I guess you would say after the Bolshevik Revolution as well. But that's kind of around the time that the U.S. gets involved in the war, 1917, 1918. So it's an interesting argument. Now you could look at this, today with U.S. growing conflicts between Russia and China. You could make the same argument from those governments. Putin, maybe his invasion of the Ukraine. So I think it's a very powerful argument. I think it says a lot for why war continues to be, an important, feature of modern day life. It's not always or simply just a conquest of resources and things like that, but it is also a way to basically, as he says, preserve social cohesion at home as well. Anyway, it's interesting that Shakespeare puts that in the mouth of the servants as well. Kind of shows you that the servants may be, even though they're not as sophisticated, I guess you would say, as what I just read out here, they at least have some insight into it. They kind of understand, at least on an intuitive level, basically what's going on. So you go back, scene 6 again of Act 4. Now Rome seems like a better place, right? I mean, it's not falling apart. It's not going into chaos because Coriolanus is not here to protect them. At least not at first. So the tribunes speak. They say, "We hear not of him, neither need we fear him. His remedies are tame. The present peace and quietness of the people, which before were in wild hurry, here do make his friends. Blush that the world goes well, who rather had, though they themselves did suffer by the behold, dissentious numbers pestering streets, then see our tradesmen singing in their shops and going about their functions friendly." So people are singing, while they're at work, and everyone's getting along well. So outwardly, at least until the invasion comes, of course, led by Coriolanus, it seems like Rome is actually a better place. It seems that the class conflict has kind of settled down a little bit. Even Menenius, who's of course up until now been his biggest supporter, even he kind of changes his tune a little bit. Right? He even says, "Yeah, you know what? He should have compromised a little bit more. All's well, and might have been much, much better. He could have temporized," meaning basically, tempered himself, meaning, sort of restrained himself a little bit, or again, compromised a little bit more. So even Menenius, who was there when he left at the beginning of Act 4, seems to have now kind of, yeah, maybe things aren't so bad without him. But of course, this is the calm before the storm. By the end of the scene, they find out that Coriolanus is now leading an army against the Romans. Oh no, actually, well, before then, they go on to say that, yeah, he was not a bad guy. He was a good officer, but again, he was insolent. He was overcome with pride, ambitious, self-loving. Again, saying things about him, whatever your impressions of the tribunes are, a lot of things that they say seem to be true. They don't seem to be lying or saying things that are blatantly incorrect. The gods have well prevented it. Rome sits safe and still without him. And then, of course, they find out that Coriolanus is leading an army against them. Now, another thing to point out is that it's not quite clear how much time has passed between scenes 5 and 6, but you would imagine a significant amount of time. I mean, the scene 5 ends with Coriolanus just meeting Aufidius, for the first time, at least since they last fought. And then by scene 6, he's already leading an army against Rome. I mean, leading and mobilizing an army, I guess the Volscians were already in a state of siege, already in a state of military preparation. So maybe it didn't take that long, but I would imagine it would have still taken at least a few months, basically. I mean, if they were not mobilized at all, maybe as much as a year. Maybe not quite that long, but I mean, some amount of time basically must have passed between scene 5 and scene 6, although it's not quite specified how much. So this part is kind of funny. Cominius comes in, who was again one of the other military commanders he comes in, he starts talking about all the things that are happening. Blaming the tribunes for it. You have helped to ravish your own daughters and to melt the city lads upon your pates, to see your wives dishonored to your noses. Menenius tries to find out, well, what's going on? What are you talking about? And Comenius just keeps like listing horrible things that are happening. Your temple is burned in their cement, and your franchises whereupon you stood confined into an augur's board. He's like, the news, what's going on? I thought that part was kind of like he doesn't want to say it at first, or he just keeps listing these things without actually getting to the point and saying what was actually going on. So Menenius, of course, as soon as he finds out that Coriolanus is invading, changes his tune again. He's back to blaming the tribunes. So do the citizens, for that matter. We see first, second, and third citizens show up again, who we saw earlier on in the play, and now they claim that they never wanted to banish Coriolanus. They say, "Oh, I thought it was a pity that they got rid of him, and I never wanted to do that." And they all say that, even though they were literally calling for his death. Earlier on in the play. So, not the best view of the people, right? The people do seem very fickle. They, blow with the wind, so to speak, or change with the wind, whatever that saying is. They're against Coriolanus, then they like him, then they change their tune again, then they like him again. So, they're very inconsistent in that regard. Although, to be fair, so are some of the other people. The tribunes seem to be somewhat consistent. I mean, Menenius, you could argue, changes his tune more than they do as well. Now, in scene 7, which is the last scene of Act 4, it's interesting in that, Aufidius is speaking without Coriolanus being around. And again, this is a great way, speaking of the dramatic form, again, a great way to end this act. At the very end of the scene, basically reveals what his true intentions are. And he's basically planning, at least it sounds this way here, he's basically planning to kill Coriolanus as soon as they're done. One fire drives out one fire, one nail, rights by rights falter, strengths by strengths do fail. Come, let's away. When Caius Rome is thou art poorest of all, then shortly art thou mine. Now he's not speaking to Caius or Coriolanus when this is going on. He's speaking to somebody else. So basically, what I get out of this, at least, is he's saying, "Yeah, you're mine." Basically, meaning, I'm going to kill you when this is done. So a little bit of betrayal there, right? He's essentially using him to get the Romans. Now, as we see in the end of the next act, Aufidius does kill Coriolanus, but it's meant to be sort of like an act of passion, like an impulse, and also claims that his decision to kill Coriolanus, or his impulse to kill Coriolanus, was motivated by Coriolanus's betrayal. Again, I'm assuming everyone's read this, so we know that Coriolanus doesn't carry through his invasion of Rome. He does relent at the last minute because of an appeal from his mother. But Aufidius acts like that's the reason why he kills him. Yet it seems like he planned on basically killing him all along. And again, this is a great tense way to end this act. So now we get to Act 5, Scene 1. So everyone is worried now. They've tried to speak to Coriolanus, or they've tried to get through to him at least. He's not listening to reason. Comenius says that basically, I tried talking to him. He says he's not going to spare us, meaning his friends, even his family. He compares them to a grain or two in a pile of chaff. Chaff being like the useless part of the grain. He said, "'Tis was folly for one poor grain or two to leave unburnt, and still to nose the offense. For one poor grain or two, I am one of those." This is Menenius talking again, who's almost like comic relief, but maybe not entirely, but has some funny moments. He's like, I'm part of part of the grain that he's talking. He's gonna burn me too. And again, his mother, his wife, his child, and this brave fellow too. We are the grains. You are the musty chaff, and you are smelt above the moon. We must be burnt for you. Meaning, it's okay if you kill the tribunes and a good portion of the people, but believe us, we're the valuable ones. We're not the chaff. We're the grains. So again, scene 2, Menenius goes to speak to Coriolanus, does not go well. The soldiers basically mock him for banishing Coriolanus in the first place. Coriolanus does eventually speak. He says, wife, mother, child, I know not. It's like, I don't know these people. He's basically saying they're dead to me, basically. My affairs are servanted to others, though I owe my revenge properly. My remission lies in Volscian breasts, that we have been familiar. In great forgetfulness shall poison rather than pity. Note how much, therefore, be gone. Mine ears against your suits are stronger than your gates against my force. Yet for I love thee, take this along. I writ it for thy sake, and would have sent it. Another word, Menenius, I will not hear thee speak. This man, Aufidius, was my beloved in Rome, yet thou beholdest. Meaning he's now talking to Aufidius. He's saying, look, this guy used to be my, he was my man, basically. But I'm going to kill this guy now, as soon as I get a chance to, in combat or after the invasion takes place. I'm not going to spare him. I'm not going to spare anybody. He's literally saying, I'm going to kill everybody. I'm going to kill everyone I get my hands on. Which is kind of crazy because, when he leaves the city, he has a very tearful goodbye, not just with Menenius, but, especially with his wife, Virgilia, and his mother, Volumina. So he's now done a shocking about face. And now he doesn't feel any, sympathy for them at all. Although, as we'll see, that might not be the case once he's actually confronted by them. But now, at the very least, he's not intending to show any mercy here. I think it comes later on. I know I didn't write it down, but there's an interesting part where they compare him to a butterfly, and I think it's in a later scene. But he says, they compare, a grub, which I think is a caterpillar, to a butterfly. They say that Coriolanus is like a man that has now become a dragon. He's also gone through this kind of metamorphosis and turned into something, insane, basically, just this, force of nature, basically. Now the big scene in this act, of course, is scene 3, when Volumina speaks to Coriolanus. It's a fairly long speech, broken up into several, a couple of different parts. So I didn't, have the whole thing here, obviously, but the one part that I think spoke to me the most is where she says, speak to me, son, thou hast affected the fine strains of honor, to imitate the graces of the gods, to tear with thunder the wide cheeks of the air, and yet to charge thy sulfur with a bolt that should but rive an oak. Essentially, how she appeals to him. She tries to build him different ways. Look, this is your family. What are you doing here? They even bring their Coriolanus' son, who also basically threatens to fight his father. It's kind of funny. Kind of takes after him, I guess. But eventually, and he's obviously affected by seeing them. It's one thing to talk about this, but now actually seeing them in person obviously is affecting him. But what seems to finally get through to him is when she again appeals to his sense of honor. That you think that you're doing something honorable here, but this is actually going to dishonor in the eyes of people, and really in the eye, in the eyes of history. You're not going to be looked at as a good person. You're going to be looked at as a traitor, somebody who, again, acted with this, furious anger, tearing open the cheeks of the air, as she says, which is an interesting line, out of a kind of, misguided sense of vengeance. And that seems to, eventually get through to him. And he agrees not to, in the presence of Aufidius, who at first seems to be okay with it, but then as we see, is not. And trying to think if there's anything else I want to say about that. Oh, I guess not. Like I said, I mean, it's a fairly long speech. I only, pulled out one little part of it, but obviously the most, impactful part of this act, I would say. And again, so she basically gets him to call off the invasion. I think it's actually scene 4 where they compare him to a butterfly and say, he's like a man that's become a dragon. Now the plebs are again about to kill Brutus, one of the tribunes, when they find out the Coriolanus has called off the called off the invasion. So again, people just switching back and forth. Scene 5, which is so short, I just included here. Basically, just a scene, welcoming home the women, sort of triumphant return after getting Coriolanus to basically call off the invasion. And then scene 6, again, the last scene of the play. Aufidius conspires to kill Coriolanus. He meets with, as it says, 3 or 4 different conspirators. We're just referred to that in the play. Now, again, he claims it is because Coriolanus betrayed him, because he said, look, he's going to fight with us now. He's not going to. So he states that's his reason for doing it. But again, as we know from the end of Act 4, it sounds like he was planning on doing this all along. And they do kill him. They kill him in the presence of the lords of the Volsci, who don't want Coriolanus to be killed. It's presented as this sort of impulsive moment. Now, after they kill him, they also proclaim him honorable, and they as he says, my rage is gone and I'm struck with sorrow, which is an interesting line as well, because again, oftentimes people act out of anger and then regret it afterwards. But how much did he actually regret it? I'm not quite sure, because again, it seems like he intended on doing that all along, like I said. And that's basically it. That is the end of the play. So hope people enjoyed it. Again, it's probably not one of Shakespeare's plays that are, always comes to mind, when you think of Shakespeare's great plays. But again, many people consider this to be among his greatest works, if not, in fact, his greatest work, as T.S. Eliot thought, and various others. So again, the themes of class conflict, I think, play out very strongly within this play. I think that's what stands out most about it. Like in most of Shakespeare's plays, again, the characters are fairly complex, so they all have some flaws. Coriolanus, obviously. Again, as I said, with the tribunes, I mean, it's I think they're one of the more questionable characters, how they are portrayed in the play. They mostly seem to be portrayed in a fairly negative way, although they do survive, which is an interesting thing. Usually, Shakespeare's plays usually have a pretty big body count by the end of the play. I mean, most of the characters usually end up getting killed. Now, this is supposed to be based on actual historical events, so that probably maybe is limiting Shakespeare to some extent. It's interesting that as I mentioned, the setting of Coriolanus takes about 400 years or more, maybe about 450 years before the events of Julius Caesar. Although it is believed that Coriolanus is a real historical person, there are people that think that he's kind of a mythological figure as well, and going that far back, I guess the historical records are much less uncertain. So maybe Shakespeare was limited to that extent, although I guess he could have changed things around, I guess, if he wanted to. So the tribunes do survive. I would say they're mostly portrayed as kind of schemers, like I said. On the other hand, a lot of things that they say seem to make sense, and a lot of the things that they say seem true as well. So, I mean, that's pretty much it. I mean, I guess I'll look to what people have written about it. I mean, if anyone has any further comments right now. Otherwise, I guess we can, this is it. I mean, I did get through the other acts. If I didn't, I would have maybe recorded another class just so I could finish off the play. Unfortunately, or fortunately rather, I did get through that. So that pretty much wraps that up. As far as the final papers go, I will add something on Canvas where you can submit the paper. I haven't done it yet, but basically, there'll be something there where you can upload your final paper to. I'll send an announcement out when I do that. But the papers are due, I believe, I have it right here, on the 9th. So it's about 2 weeks from now. You can you can upload them, anytime between now and then. So that's pretty much it. I mean, again, hopefully everyone enjoyed the class, and the format of the class. I enjoy teaching this class. I enjoy, talking to everyone and, reading everyone's work. Okay, so if there's nothing else, then I guess we'll just end things here. So take care, everyone. Have a nice semester and summer and all that. And take care.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
You
Thank
too.
you, Professor.
Take care.